Welcome to American Club of Sweden, Lennart.
Thank you.
Why did you start writing about this theme, about immigrants going to the US and the New World?
We discussed this when we were talking about different new book projects, and that it was time to do something about immigration, because I mean it's one of the major stories in Swedish history, really. Like 1/5 of the population left and crossed the Atlantic. When it turned out that the publisher thought it was interesting enough, so they asked me to do a proposal for 3 books, which made me much more interested, because when this came together with a theme that I have the 3 books, the New World, the New City, the New Times, I felt like I could tell this story give a broader perspective and maybe tell it in a somewhat a new way, even if I'm relying on sort of material or sources that are known. I still think I can tell the story in a different way.
Did you reflect on the Swedish perspective that we're still stuck in a way with Vilhelm Moberg's The Immigrants and the picture of one family going abroad or one small piece?
Yeah, I did. I mean, as a matter of fact, when I started this, a lot of people asked me, why are you doing this? Hasn't Vilhelm Moberg already done this? And of course, I mean, he did fiction and this is non-fiction, but I think as I say, I think I, of course, reread the books now when I worked with my own books, and I think they are fantastic. But it's also just because they've been so successful, I think they have sort of given the Swedes the idea that this is the way it was, and what he wrote about what's really like was a small slice of this whole process, and. Because also the success with the films afterwards by John Turrell, and then of course the musical Kristina från Duvemåla, I think this is sort of like what Swedes think of when they hear about immigration to the U.S. And what he wrote about was in the early 1850s, and they were pioneers, and they broke up from land in the south of Sweden and came to Minnesota and broke new land there. I try to give sort of like a bigger perspective, starting in the 1600s with the Swedish colony in New Sweden, and then going all the way up till the sort of like the end of mass immigration in the 1920s. And I think one sort of like thing that it's worth thinking of is that most Swedes didn't actually become farmers in the new country or in the new world. They actually ended up in cities, mostly in Chicago.
That's quite a different picture than the one we picture, that they continued what they were doing in Sweden.
And the later immigration also, when Mobergs, Karl-Oskar and Kristina left, they were mostly families in the early stages. Later, towards the end of the 1800s, there were single people who left on their own, and it's an interesting thing, I think, is that of all the people who came to Chicago, all the Swedes, there were more single women than single men. So that was a huge thing to break up from the Swedish countryside, go to one of the fastest growing and biggest cities in the world, and that was also part of the beginning of women's emancipation movement in Sweden, actually.
Also, they came to a country that was being born, so to say, as a federation or nation state. Should we be more proud as Swedes, having Swedes being active in that process in the US?
Well, I mean, what I'm trying to do is there's a lot of history here, so I'm trying to of U.S. history, the birth of as I say, from the Revolutionary War, the development of democracy, the idea of religious freedom, and especially, I think, the opportunities for social mobility, and that sort of had a large part of the attraction for the Swedes who went. So, in that sense, it's important to write more about the attraction in the U.S., I think, than what many have done before. I'm trying to avoid being overly nationalistic, romantic, and so, I mean, a lot of Swedes were successful, and of course they were part of that. That, you know, this old saying that America was formed by the immigrants, and the immigrants were formed by America, which is true, and the Swedes were part of that. But I mean, I hesitate to make it that Swedes were, you know, very different and much more successful, and you can say the same thing about other nation groups.
But was there any destiny for a Swede coming to the U.S. that fascinated you more than others?
I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, there's a. I find it interesting that there were a number of Swedes coming in between. After the Swedish colony, New Sweden, fell in 1655, there were 200 years between, really, or until mass immigration started. And there were a number of Swedes who came to the U.S. during that time. There were a couple of, you know, what I thought was very interesting, who came around 1750. Per Kalm, who was sent out by Linnaeus to look for American plants in the New World. And he befriended Benjamin Franklin and took home ideas to Sweden at that time. And there was another Swedish priest, Israel Acrelius, who also was influenced by Franklin. He studied Franklin's academy, which became University of Pennsylvania, brought his ideas home to Sweden, and which sort of influenced the ongoing debate about reforming the Swedish educational system. So what I'm trying to show here that these impulses between Sweden and the US has a long history going on for a long time.
And today we hear that the relations between US and Sweden is better than ever. But how do you see more footprints, let's say, more bonds created then that are still engaged today?
I mean, of course you see them. I mean, I have to think, though, that to be realistic, that, you know, mass immigration, as we know it, that ended in the 20s. And 1923 was the last year with, you know, a big number of Swedes going. And there aren't really, or at least very few people who immigrated and have their own memories of it. So we're down to, you know, generations later, third or fourth generation. So, you know, so you can see that people maybe get nostalgic about it, but I think more sort of like the lesson to learn is they become Americanized, which is not necessarily a bad thing when you look at the Sweden as a becoming more a country of immigrants too. I mean, it's a good story about integration.
At the same time, recent research say that if Stockholmers were to choose another place to live instead of Stockholm, they would choose New York City.
No, that's true. I mean, there's a lot of interest in New York. I can see that, and obviously there's a lot of people coming there and visiting. I mean, I think that's a different thing, though. Then you can't really compare that to the immigration movement. You know, it's nice that people like New York and that they go there, but you know, it's very different. People come for different reasons, and you know, more because it's fun, I guess.
Can you relate somehow with your own travels to the US and settling down there, writing this book and seeing all the immigrants that has been doing that before?
Yes and no. I mean, I didn't go. I mean, I've been living in New York for about 30 years, so I guess I should. But I mean, I didn't come there to as an immigrant. I just went there as a correspondent for a newspaper, and that's, you know, then I stayed on, and then 30 years later you think of time passes, time flies by. But I do. I mean, of course, I've been working as a journalist during many years. I've been in contact with, you know, what's sort of like still there of the old Swedish America. Yes, certainly.
Do you perceive Manhattan differently when you walk there, having written so extensively about it from a different perspective now?
Well, I mean, I think more about the history. Yeah, that's true. I mean, you know, there is a lot of history in New York, and it's and the cities, definitely.
How do you hope the books will change the views? What is your hope for the books?
I don't know if they will change the views. I think, one interesting aspect is sort of when I start with the 1600s, the colonialism. I met American researchers who've been working with this, and they are kind of surprised. Why aren't more Swedes looking into this, and why isn't more attention being paid? And I guess their explanation has been that this doesn't really square with the Swedish self-image, that Sweden was really colonialistic and were there together with the French and the English and the Dutch. But so therefore, I hope that I start very early in the 1600s, that will give like a longer and broader perspective on this.
Was there something that you found doing research that made you go, I didn't know that, or ooh, what interesting?
Yeah, I don't think that anything like surprised me like that. But I have to admit, I was struck by how backward Sweden was at the time, because it's I know about it. Of course, I know that it wasn't a modern country in those 1700s and early 1800s or so. But it was a very sort of static society, very class-bound, and with state religion and so on, and that played a bigger part in people's, at least in the early part of the immigration, on the interest in immigration than I had thought. I think.
Thank you for joining us, and good luck today and with the book.
Thank you.